Hi, I'm Lance Tailfeathers. The teepee was the traditional dwelling of the North American Indian for centuries past. Today, the teepee is still being used by contemporary Native people, and the tradition surrounding those unique dwellings lives on. In this edition of the Buffalo Journal, we take a look at teepee life then and now. Also on today's show, we look at the colorful history of the Blood Indians who have lived on the plains for generations past. The Métis were a vital link between the white immigrants and Indian tribes during the early years of Canada. But as history will tell us, they have fought hard to gain recognition as an Aboriginal group. The Buffalo Journal's Rick Tailfeathers has this report.
The story of the Maytee is a dark page in the history of Canada. Despite their obvious roots in this country, they have fought a hard battle for recognition as an Aboriginal group within the context of Canadian politics and culture. The Métis story starts generations ago when the first white men came to the shores of this country looking for the promised land. What they found was a wilderness inhabited by native people. As history will tell us, these early immigrants found companionship and support from the Indian women, whose skills and knowledge of the land helped them survive. And so, this union between white men and native women gave birth to a new breed, the Métis. The Métis became the backbone of the Canadian fur trade. They were the vital link between the Indian hunters and trappers and the European traders that exported the goods to their homeland. The Canadian fur trade thrived until the early 18th century. With changing fashions in Europe and the eventual overkill of Canadian fur-bearing animals, the downfall of the fur trade was inevitable. The Métis were forced to adapt. Agriculture became their source of livelihood. The Métis, who were predominantly from Quebec, were forced to move to the Red River region of what is now Manitoba, where agriculture was more viable. The Great Canadian Land Grab during the 18th century was also a factor in the Métis' migration to the Red River. They were forced west by a new wave of European immigrants. In 1869, 2 years after Confederation, the name of Louie Riel became prominent in the Canadian Northwest when the Métis in the Red River area resisted the invasion of immigrants to their lands. Riel, who led the Métis, formed his own government and took control of the Red River settlements. Louie Riel, who had strong ties with the Roman Catholic Church, had a vision of a united Aboriginal front, with the half-breeds joining forces with the full-bloods to create a new political order. Riel tried to join these forces.
Work on the Blackfoot Reserve. One of the few white guys around that can speak fairly good Blackfoot.
Prominent historian from the Glenbow Museum in Calgary, Hugh Dempsey, saw Riel as a historic part of the development of the Canadian West.
And he got his people behind him, and he said, we're not going to let the surveyors come in, we're not going to let the government come in, we want to have some discussion about Métis rights. Well, the upshot of this was that the document was signed. The Canadian government wasn't in the West. The Hudson's Bay Company no longer had any authority. So there was a governmental vacuum. And in that vacuum, Louie Riel set up a provisional government. And over the next several weeks, he and a number of English and French Métis ran the provisional government. Now this was okay, except for the fact that they had some trouble with one of the surveyors in particular, a man by the name of Thomas Scott, who is an English-speaking Protestant Orangeman. Now an Orangeman has been very radical Protestant. And because of his loud mouth and because of the other problems with him, they ended up executing him. Well, this got the entire province of Ontario angry at Riel, because Ontario was English-speaking Protestant and Riel was French-speaking Catholic. So the military was sent out to take over the country on behalf, the West, on behalf of Canada, and to kick out Riel and this provisional government. And so this was done. Lord Wolseley and the British troops and Canadian troops marched west. They arrived in 1870, early on in 1870, and Louie Riel had to flee for his life.
Riel was driven south to the U.S., where he was in exile. The Métis resistance was temporarily subdued. In the broader scenario, Sir John A. Macdonald, who was known as the father of Canadian Confederation, saw Canada stretching from coast to coast. The Métis were a threat to his Canadian dream. The fire of the Métis resistance movement continued to burn. Many of the Métis joined other groups in the west and moved to central Saskatchewan, to Batoche. Batoche became the capital of the Métis resistance. This was where Gabriel Dumont and others rallied and planned their next moves. In the words of another noted historian, Terry Lusty, who is a descendant of those first Métis settlers, Riel's return to Canada to fight for the Métis was inevitable.
If the government continued to ignore the Métis, something was bound to happen, and it did. In March of 1885, all hell broke loose when a confrontation between Northwest Mounted Police and some volunteer troops from Prince Albert met in confrontation with the Métis at Duck Lake. It was March 26th. The Métis in that confrontation only had approximately 30 men under the leadership of Gabriel Dumont, Riel's right-hand man, Riel's military genius, who later became acknowledged as being one of the best guerrilla warfare type fighters in the world for his time.
Louie Riel joined the forces of the Métis and the Indians, Poundmaker, Big Bear, and Wandering Spirit. The government forces retreated at the Battle of Duck Lake. But at Batoche, it was a different story.
And the main body of the military came in and attacked Batoche. Now, once they attacked Batoche and they overran Batoche, the rebellion was virtually over, because that had been almost like the territorial capital of Métis people. And once that was taken, they kind of dispersed to the winds. It was a tremendous battle, the military trying to use British fighting tactics, and the Métis being excellent guerrilla fighters. And so when you consider the odds against the Métis, they put up a tremendous fight. But they lost. They were scattered around, and as they were being scattered and dispersed to the winds, Louie Riel among them, Louie Riel was captured. Gabriel Dumont and some others escaped, went down to the States, but Riel was captured, brought back, and at that point, it was no longer a military campaign, it was now a political battle. The rights of the Métis were now completely ignored because they had been rebels. And so who was going to give any rights to rebels? I mean, this was the attitude they took. But what were they going to do with Riel?
Louie Riel was executed in the spring of 1885 for treason. Sir John A. Macdonald did fulfill his dream of joining the West with the East. But by hanging Riel, he left bitter wounds in the Métis people. But the seed for the Métis political fight for Aboriginal rights was planted. And as history will tell us, it grew in the years to follow. When we return, more about the Métis unique history. Few history books give credit to the Métis for their contribution to Canadian society. Without their assistance to the white immigrants during the early days, Canada may not have been what it is today. My quest for knowledge about the Métis history took me to the Glenbow Museum in Calgary, where I found a very interesting Métis exhibit. Glenbow has a very good collection of Métis artifacts, some dating back 100 years or more. This Red River cart is perfectly restored and looks much the same as it would have a century ago. The cart was very versatile and was even used to float its cargo across the rivers by taking the wheels off and using them for a raft. The Red River carts hauled goods all across the Canadian Northwest. The Métis were known for their love of music and adapted their dances from European jigs and other dances. This tradition is still followed today. Having roots in both the Indian and white society, the Métis adapted to both cultures. Their clothing was often a mix of both white and Indian. Many Métis were skilled hunters and trappers. They had learned the secrets of the Plains Indian buffalo hunters and mastered it during the 1870s. The bright red sash they wore around their waist was one of their unique characteristics. The Métis played a prominent role in the settlement of the Canadian West, but in many cases they were left out of its history books. They were also left out of the treaty negotiations and land entitlement. In the next episode of the Buffalo Journal, we will look at contemporary Métis society.
The traditional home of the nomadic Plains Indian is the tipi, a conical-shaped structure, when covered with buffalo hides, was both warm in the winter and cool in the summer. The painted design is unique to each tipi, but some symbols are the same on all tipis and represent the world and the universe. In the 90s, the tipi is alive and well. Today, the Buffalo Journal takes both an historic and a contemporary look at the tipi. According to archaeologists, the Great Plains of southern Alberta and northern Montana have been occupied by the Plains Indians for 12,000 years. The primary beast of burden up until the early 1700s was the dog. Consequently, the early tipi was smaller. An example of this tipi can be seen at the Head Smashed In Buffalo Jump near Fort Macleod, Alberta. Anywhere from 8 to 12 buffalo cowhides were used to cover the frame. When the horse was introduced in the early 1700s, 12 to 16 buffalo hides became the standard. The main design around the middle was different on every tipi. These designs were acquired through visions and could only be used by the person who received the vision, and could not be copied by anyone. These designs could, however, be transferred through a ceremony to a new owner. These designs date back thousands of years. The top and bottom symbols are similar on all tipis. Around the bottom are rings. If the rings have round humps in them, those represent the foothills. If there are sharp peaks, those represent the mountains. And if there is a straight line, that represents the plains. The circles in the rings around the bottom represent puffballs, which are called stars, or kakatusi, in the Blackfoot language. The designs at the top of the tipi represent the sky and the stars. The top part is painted either blue, dark red, or black, and represents the night. Tipis were erected with the door facing east. On the south ear flap are 6 circles representing the 6 orphan children who went to the skies as stars because of their poor existence on earth. This constellation is Pleiades. On the north ear flap are 7 circles representing the 7 children who fled to the skies. This constellation is now known as the Big Dipper, or Ursa Major. The rings around the top represent clouds. Different colored rings represent the rainbow. The Maltese cross in the back represents the butterfly, the bringer of sleep. Horsehair at the center or below the cross indicates that a previous owner captured horses from an enemy. Today, teepee life is alive and well. It is used at ceremonial and religious functions, such as the annual sun dances, pipe ceremonies, and transfer ceremonies. It is also used in the modern social culture. Each summer, hundreds of Plains Indians travel the Great Powwow Trail, running from New Mexico to northern Alberta. Each weekend, teepee villages are erected and participants enjoy a modern version of camp life. Competition dancing has become big time in Indian country. One of the best-known powwow travelers today is Harold Healy. Harold can be seen at all the major powwows, winning numerous awards, and just as important, keeping teepee traditions alive.
I don't think it's ever going to end. The younger generation are for that too, and a lot of young people are building teepees, and they use their teepees too, and which is a good thing. We try our best to teach the young people how to put up a teepee so they can carry on.
Today, some tribes have lost the significance of the symbols and the transfer ceremonial songs, but the age-old art of assembling the teepee remains the same.
Well, first of all, what we do is spread out the teepee in halfway, and then you put your 2 poles on each end, then crisscross the poles up on top, but the middle of the opening of the teepee. And when that's done, we do the tying. When that's all done, then it takes a few minutes to put the 4 poles up. Then you start putting your poles up. There's a certain way you put your teepee poles up, and then you put your the lodge pole up last, that's what holds the teepee up. When you have your teepee all put together with the buttons and everything, then you start pegging your teepee down. And then at the very last you put 2 poles that would hold the flaps. It's doing the outside. And then you go inside and you start putting your dew cloths. When that's all done, then you put your start putting your bedding down, like buffalo hides or anything that you want to use inside.
Teepee life will be around well into the future. The religious and social culture of today's Indian is ever growing stronger.
Coming up, Kainai. In the days of the ancient ones, a Blackfoot came to the Blood Indian camp. "Who is the chief here?" he asked the first man he met. "I am," was the reply. A second man stopped and said, "I am the chief." Soon the bewildered Blackfoot was surrounded by several men, all claiming to be chief of the Bloods. "I will call you the tribe of many chiefs," he said at last. So it was then that they received the name Kainai, from Aka, many, and Nina, chief. This legend has a theme which is evident throughout the history of the Bloods. Just as the early people showed such independence that each was a chief unto himself, so did the tribe maintain a spirit of freedom, self-confidence, and pride during its recorded nomadic history. While they call themselves Kainai, the Cree term for the tribe was Red People, from their use of red ochre on their faces and ceremonial objects. The first traders adopted the Bloods, a name which has come into common use. The main enemies of the Bloods were the Cree and the Assiniboine to the north and east, the Crow to the south, and the Shoshone, Nez Perce, Flathead, and Kootenai across the mountains. The Sarsi, an offshoot of the Beaver Indians of northern Alberta, became their allies and adopted a Blackfoot culture. The Groventiers also were allies until 1861, when a misunderstanding over a stolen horse resulted in bitter hostilities. The religion of the Blood was based upon the belief that the sun was a major deity, the moon was his wife, and the morning star their son. Each summer the tribe would gather for the Sundance ceremony, which was performed in fulfillment of a holy woman's vow. The horse and the gun, both of European origin, were largely responsible for the high degree of organization and mobility of the Bloods. As far as can be determined, the Bloods obtained their first horses in the early 1700s, possibly from the Nez Perce or other plateau tribes. Until the Spanish brought horses into Mexico, these beasts had been unknown to the North American Indians. But the Bloods, like other tribes, quickly adopted the animal, which soon became a necessary part of their lives. Horses provided a means of easier hunting and as a symbol of possessions limited to the load carried by a few dogs. Gone were the constant hunts for buffalo, which came within range of the flint-tipped arrows or could be driven over cliffs. The precautious mode of existence, which left little time for war or pleasure, became something of the past. The decade of the 1860s marked the first big change in the life of the Bloods. Gold miners began moving into Montana, followed by small ranchers. The inevitable skirmishes of the American frontier followed, with the Bloods often being involved. In the last episode of the Buffalo Journal, we asked you this question. What contemporary Native politician altered the course of Canadian politics by blocking passage of an infamous accord? Here's the answer. Elijah Harper, an elected MLA for the Manitoba government, stalled the passage of the Meech Lake Accord during the summer of 1990. He became a hero to many Canadians by standing up for something he believed was being left out, Aboriginal rights. Today's trivia question is this. What city in southern Alberta is named after a Native legend? We'll have the answer for you next time. That's it for this edition of the Buffalo Journal. Hope you enjoyed it. I'm Lance Tailfeathers. Bye for now.